because Rodgers wanted to be at the very front of the column. And he goes down to try to save Gosport Navy Yard. Rodgers and Warren miss the boat as it's leaving, and so they get captured. Good midday to everyone. My name is John Corsine. I'm Director Emeritus of the USS Monitor Center here at the Mariners Museum. And so one person that really warrants a great discussion is not this guy, but the guy is named John Rodgers. Although this is also John Rodgers, this is the father of the Civil War John Rodgers, who was a hero during the War of 1812. Actually, he almost caused the War of 1812 to start in May of 1811 when he fired on this British ship known as the Little Belt and damaged it badly, and because he thought it was another ship that had impressed U.S. sailors. And so then, almost at the same spot, right off the Capes, 3 days after the war began, he was commander of the United States frigate, the President, and he will fight the Belvidera, which escapes, but he causes great damage to it because night comes, it's hard to track other ships. So anyway, what will transpire is that he is a real hero. Just so happens his son is going to be born on 8 August 1812 in Havre de Grace, Maryland, and his birthplace still stands in Havre de Grace. I've been there. So I have to say that he comes from a really noted family. Now, he will join the U.S. Navy. He doesn't have much choice. I'll just tell you about the Rodgers family. John Rodgers' brother was a colonel in the Revolutionary War. John Rodgers, the man we're going to talk about here, grandson was a aviator for the U.S. Navy, crashed and died. His son became a rear admiral in the U.S. Navy. Couple of his cousins are involved during the war, and one of them marries the daughter of Matthew Galbraith Perry. So this is a really close linked group of people when you think about the old Navy. Nevertheless, this is the first ship that John Rodgers is going to serve on. This is the Constellation before it's reseed from a frigate into a sloop. You can go to Baltimore and see its configuration as a sloop. So while serving on board the Constellation, he will get involved. They land Blue Jackets and Marines, and they defeat the one group of Seminoles during the Second Seminole War. He's considered a great hero, and so he then is assigned to the North Pacific Exploring Expedition, right? Which he was XO, executive officer, under a man known as Cadwallader Ringgold. Ringgold gets malaria, so Rodgers takes over command. Now they're going throughout the North Pacific, Kamchatka, and exploring and noting where islands are. So that's gives him a great deal of experience in command of an expedition. When they return in 1855, he's named as commander of the U.S. Navy's Japan office. Because I have to tell you, ever since Matthew Galbraith Perry opened the door to China, or to Japan, we start to have a closer and closer relationship. You can see a delegation of Japanese, I don't think they're sailors, but Japanese, they all have their swords and everything like that. And there's a picture with Franklin Buchanan, and John Rodgers happens to be in that picture. So anyway, John Rodgers, this is, of course, this is a map created by John Rodgers, believe it or not, from the North Pacific, North Pacific Expedition. Before he moves to Washington, he will help build the Mare Island Navy Yard in San Francisco. The real person in charge of the project is a man known as David Glasgow Farragut. But nevertheless, Rodgers is there, and this becomes one of the finest naval yards for the U.S. Navy. And you got to figure it's way over, right, in California, and we have a Pacific Fleet, so that's where we maintain the fleet at. It does is home port for the first ironclad on the West Coast, which is called the Comanche. Nevertheless, so he's up at the Japan office in Washington, D.C. Of course, war clouds come. You have the bombardment of Fort Sumter, and oh my gosh, this is all terrible. And Virginia decides to leave the Union on April 17, 1861. So, Flag Officer Hiram Paulding is given a task force using the USS Gunboat Pawnee, and he goes down to try to save Gosport Navy Yard. Just remember, Gosport Navy Yard, are, as we know today, Norfolk Naval Shipyard, is the largest naval base in the United States. So despite Virginia leaving, we want to keep it, but the Virginians want it even more. And sadly, they had a bad commander of Gosport, a man known as Commodore Charles Stewart Macaulay, who drank too much and had a lot of problems. And so he sets fire to the yard. By the time Paulding arrives, John Rodgers, along with an engineer known as Gouverneur Warren, right, one of the heroes of Gettysburg, they will rush through the yard, and they'll try to destroy the granite dry dock. They lay fuses and everything, and they're slow in getting out of there. One sympathizer for the South broke the powder train, and so as a result of that, the dry dock doesn't blow up. That dry dock is going to be used to transform the frigate Merrimack into the ironclad ram Virginia. Wow. So guess what? Rodgers and Warren miss the boat as it's leaving, and so they get captured. Now, at this time, Virginia has not joined the Confederacy. These are militia troops that are operating around Gosport Navy Yard, Virginia militia. And so they said, well, you get on a packet, you can go. And so they're never POWs or anything. We hadn't figured out what type of war this is going to be. So they are able to come back to Washington, D.C. Now, Rodgers is going to be assigned to create the Western Gunboat Flotilla. And the big thing is that he's, of course, a brilliant naval officer even by this time. But the Gideon Welles says, well, I'm too busy having a blockade, so the Army can take command of all this. And the person in charge of the Department of the West at that time was an uppity person we know as Major General John Fremont. And, he's not let's just say, he's very stickly, and Rodgers, being an old salt, doesn't kind of get along with him. But what Rodgers does is begin the creation of this flotilla with building timberclads. And timberclads are just gunboats with thick timber on them, but that's better than the Confederates had, with guns. And so they start to be able to control the upper Mississippi at the same time that Rodgers began the construction of what are known as the City-class ironclads. Hey, those are the Pook's turtles, and they will make a big difference. So because Rodgers doesn't get along with Fremont, he is brought back to the east, where he's going to be placed in command of a new ironclad, one of 3 built as a result of the Ironclad Board, and he takes command of the USS Galena, right? And these are the gunboats being built, City class, as you can see. Rodgers is supervising, working with James Eads to actually create this squadron. Here is the Galena. As soon as Rodgers goes on board, he says it's not worthy of being called a warship. Now, the reason being is the tumble home armor is not thick enough. And in fact, as they were building it, they had 1 line of iron plate. They backed it by rubber, and then 2 layers of 1-inch iron plate. The rubber doesn't do any good, right? In fact, when the Ironclad Board is meeting, one plan was turned in that was a rubber ironclad, right, or rubber clad. And they all say, well, that's not going to work. And he says, well, the balls are going to bounce off of it. And so the designer was reminded they have explosive shells now, and so that thing would have gone down. So nevertheless, so this is one of the 3 initial ironclads being built along the East Coast, Mystic, Connecticut, and this is actually a project organized by Cornelius Bushnell. Rodgers helps with the construction. The Galena will finally come down to Hampton Roads after the Monitor had already fought the Battle of Hampton Roads on March 9th. The Galena does not arrive until, I think it's April 26, 1862. The thing I'll say is, had the Galena been the first one in Hampton Roads, it would have been sunk by the Virginia. There's no doubt about it. Because the Galena, now John Rodgers is, there. Lincoln comes down in early May. He said, what's going on? Where's McClellan? And, he's starting to inch his way up towards Richmond after the Battle of Williamsburg. So Rodgers says, well, look, we can't support McClellan properly because we can't go into the James River because our commander, Louis Machibres Goldsborough, says we can't do that. However, I got a plan. You send the Monitor and other gunboats towards Sewell's Point, and then you send the Galena with some other warships into the James River so that when the Virginia comes out, it's faced with a difficult decision. Do I go and block the James, or do I try and save Sewell's Point Battery? Then commander of the Virginia, Josiah Tattenaw, will decide to fight against the Monitor. He really wanted to tangle with the Monitor. Doesn't happen. And so once the Union are in the river, Norfolk has to be abandoned. Rodgers is a real hero, and he takes command of an expedition that he is going to move up the James River. Now, I got to tell you, this expedition is going to have some unusual ships. Number 1, the Galena. Number 2, the Monitor. Number 3, another quasi-ironclad known as Stevens Battery, also called the Naugatuck, which is a 1-gun thing. His real iron was, had ballast tanks to lower it in the water. Armed with a 100-pounder Parrott gun. And then 2 double-ender gunboats, the Port Royal and the Aroostook. And so they slowly go up to the James. Now, I got to tell you, when the Virginia is destroyed on May 11th, this is the great opportunity, because there's nothing guarding Richmond. And so Rodgers understands this. However, he's given orders that he has to stop at every Confederate fortification: Jamestown Island, Fort Boykin, Fort Huger. And of course, the Confederates, have token resistance and they leave. But because he has to stop and blow up their magazines, that slows them up, right? So he gets into the river 11 May. The crew of the Virginia gets up to a place called Drewry's Bluff on May 13th, and Rodgers and his squadron will show up on May 15, and they'll attack Drewry's Bluff. Drewry's Bluff is, there we go, is 90 feet above the water, and of course they have plunging shot. The Galena takes the lead, and because Rodgers says, I want to prove that this is not a successful design. It is said by Charles Hasker, who is a former crew member of the Virginia, that he never witnessed such seamanship, because Rodgers comes up and then turns his ship in the middle of the river so that he can bombard Drewry's Bluff. Now, the Monitor is no good because it can't elevate its guns very well. The Naugatuck, which you see in this picture, oh my gosh, guess what? Its gun burst at the third shot, so it's no good. So really, it's the Galena that's going to take the pounding. It is holed 13 times because we're shooting down with solid shot. They actually have Brook bolts there. And so this is terrible. One shot, the action begins at 7:30. By 11:30, the Galena is almost out of ammunition. Doesn't matter. One shot from the Bedford artillery, so they say. The crew of the Virginia has their own guns firing, they claim. But one shot went into the Galena and exploded and it hits right where a powder monkey is running with a load of powder. So there's that explosion. Rodgers is right next to it, okay, and he survives. He isn't touched at all. But with that, he knows that the Galena cannot withstand fighting this fixed fortification. He has no way to get through the obstructions, and as a result of all this, they retreat back downriver. Now, Rodgers is still considered, outstanding officer. He did his duty. McClellan will not support Rodgers, believe it or not, by supporting him. In other words, Rodgers writes McClellan and says, hey, look, let me tell you, if you send me a division, we'll capture this place and we'll be in Richmond without, in a day. And so, however, they don't. McClellan says, I'm too busy, do whatever you want. And so that meant they're 8 miles from Richmond. If you go to the Rockets Landing, which you can go to today, that's the head of navigation. And from there, with a 100-pounder Parrott gun, you could shell the capital of Virginia, then the capital of the Confederacy. Oh my gosh, that close. But they all appreciate what Rodgers does. He's going to be promoted to captain on 16 July, 1862. And then, of course, as we know, the Monitor, although it was an extremely flawed ship, and you can read my blogs and some other YouTube programs that tell you the various problems the Monitor had. Experimental ship. So Erickson gets to build another class known as the Passaic class. And they did a few things to improve the ship, including putting the pilot house on top of the turret, They make a rounded bottom instead of a flat bottom, enhances seaworthiness. So Rodgers will take command of the USS Weehawken, which is armed with one 15-inch Dahlgren shell gun and one 11-inch Dahlgren shell gun. Oh my gosh, powerful turret. And so he comes down to Hampton Roads, and his ship will leave Hampton Roads the same day as the Monitor leaves Hampton Roads. What happens to the Monitor? It sinks in that storm. Rodgers is in that storm. And I have to tell you, the support boats with him, they said, well, we can't handle it out here. We got to go inshore, safety. Rodgers says, well, go wherever you want. You know, my ship is going to float through all the seas without any problem. And in fact, he writes in his report that they rode out the heavy seas with relative ease, and also that the behavior of the vessel was easy, buoyant, and indicative of thorough safety. Well, he lied because he had to throw off all these shells and everything because the ship was really awash with water. Monitors are not supposed to be in storms, much less out in the Atlantic. So, but he survives. He makes it to Beaufort, North Carolina. Then he moves down to Beaufort, South Carolina at Port Royal Sound. Now, at this time, the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron is commanded by Samuel Francis DuPont. And DuPont is, of course, a DuPont. And he's been in the U.S., as a veteran of the Mexican War, outstanding officer. But he's been told by other people, like Gustavus Vasa Fox, that you must organize an ironclad attack on Charleston, that Charleston's the nest of secession, and that we have to get it, and we have to crush the very heart of secession. I mean, you should read Gustavus Vasa Fox's letters. So, and Gideon Welles supports it. So, and DuPont gets a letter from Fox saying, look, you must do this, and you don't want the Army's help. Our job here is, number one, to defeat our Southern brethren, and number two, to beat the Army, in capturing Charleston. Well, so, that's a nice order to get. So the big thing is that Charleston is like a cul-de-sac, right? Formed by the Ashley and Cooper Rivers, big harbor, and actually the harbor is well defended by Battery Wagner, Battery Gregg, Fort Sumter, what else do we have there? Fort Moultrie, Battery B, then you have Fort Johnson, Castle Pinckney. In other words, if you get past the outer ring, right, you then have to go through another ring. Plus, the Confederates have two ironclads there, the Jacora and the Palmetto State. So this is a recipe for disaster. Rodgers, they scouted the Charleston Harbor. They know there's a boom between Sumter and Fort Moultrie. At first, it was made out of railway iron. It broke with heavy tides. Now is rope and logs. And they also have barrels to keep it afloat, which look like what? Torpedoes, right? What's the great fear? Torpedoes. John Warden is actually part of this fleet with his ship, and he, the Montauk, actually ran over a torpedo and cracked its hull, but Warden's quick action saves the ship. So nevertheless, they all know that they have to go past this killing range, as it's called. When you reach abreast of Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie, you have 100 heavy cannon firing at you. Okay, so it's called the Ring of Fire. I stole that from Johnny Cash, but really, that's what's happening here. And so, actually, Erickson, who can do no wrong during this time, he says, "Well, I can stop any torpedo." So he comes up with what's known as an anti-torpedo raft, and this thing is terrible. It weighs 70 tons, excuse me, and it has grapples on it so that you could pick up torpedoes. It had its own torpedo in case they want to blow up obstructions. And so if you have a Passaic-class monitor, there we have it, and if you have one of these ships, they only go 5 knots. And now with this torpedo raft on it, which Rodgers says, "I'll use," all the other captains say, "Oh, no, we're not going to be it." Because Rodgers wanted to be at the very front of the column, right? He's after being a hero. And so what's going to transpire is that this thing is unwieldy. It means he only can go 3.5 knots. And you get near the obstructions, the tide is terrible. Actually, the Weehawken is going to actually be struck 53 times by heavy shot, which broke the side armor. You can see right there. It took a shot that broke through its deck, right, which caused a leak, of course. And the big thing is that if there was heavy sea, guess what? The Weehawken's going to go down. Actually, Rodgers, while he's there, he looks at the obstructions and writes in his report that they were so formidable that upon deliberated judgment, I thought that it might not be right to entangle the vessel in obstructions which I did not think that we could have passed through, in which we would have been caught, right? So in other words, he makes this decision at the very high moment, I'm not going to do that. But the tide's forcing it towards the obstructions. So he has to, under fire, with a hole in your deck, your turret's jammed by shot, he has to turn around and head seaward, limping his ship out of the harbor. Whoa, this is just unbelievable that he's able to save the Weehawken. The Weehawken is going to get even greater fame because it stays with the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. It's assigned to a place called Wausau Sound, which is below Savannah. And you've got a bunch of rivers flowing into it, the Wilmington River, the Savannah River. And so Rodgers is placed in command of a small squadron that basically has another ironclad, another Passaic-class ironclad, the Nahant. Just think, these Passaic-class ironclads are 100 feet long. They're armed with a 15-inch gun, 11-inch gun. In fact, the 15-inch gun is too big to really fit in the turret. They have to make it with a shorter barrel, which means they have to have a smoke box inside so the gases from firing the gun won't asphyxiate the crew members. I mean, this is called jury rigs. But nevertheless, the Confederates had jury rigged this vessel, and this vessel happens to be the CSS Atlanta. And the Atlanta is considered one of the best powered ships the Confederates build, because it was originally a merchant ship known as the Fingal with Scottish-made engines. Oh my gosh, it knew what it do, but the Tiff brothers organize its conversion, and they make a lot of mistakes. The gun ports aren't big enough. Nevertheless, there's a lot of pressure for the Atlanta to go down and attack those monitors. Now, this Josiah Tattenaw was actually in command of the squadron. He does not effectively attack those monitors. He's canned. Eventually, a man known as William Webb will take command of the Atlanta, and he is an impetuous man, I will tell you. And in fact, that's what he was at. Buchanan, Franklin Buchanan, knew him very well, and that's what he wrote as a report about William Webb. And during the March 8th battle, he actually slips his little gunboat in next to the Congress to take off wounded, and save the crew of this cutter that had tried to go to the Congress to set it on fire from the Virginia. Nevertheless, so he's a crazy guy. So he comes down, and he comes down the Wilmington River, which is very torturous, all right? If you've ever been to St. Bonaventure Cemetery, the river there is the Wilmington River, okay? So I don't hang out in graveyards, but, you had to, that's the garden of good and evil, And so anyway, the Atlanta is going to be armed with 2 7-inch Brook guns and 2 6.4 Brook guns. It's got a ram and a torpedo. So Webb's plan is, I'm going to go into Wausau Sound. I'm going to get close to one of those monitors. I'm going to blow that up with my torpedo, spar torpedo, and then I'm going to go and use my guns and my ram to sink the other one. And we will raise the blockade of Savannah. Well, this thing has a 16-foot draft. Now, what does that mean? The sound has all these shoals, and so when Webb at around 5:15, will actually come out of the Wilmington River into Wausau Sound, and actually Rodgers sees it from the Weehawken. This is at very dawn, right? And so he knows he has to get his ships in action. However, the Atlanta comes and all of a sudden jerks to a stop. It ran aground. Well, they try to back themselves out because it's so close to the bottom. They don't have proper steerage, so they only make themselves grounded the most. And they're at this type of tilt. And they have smaller gun ports, so they can't really have effective ranging with their guns. So William Webb's in trouble, especially since Rodgers is intent on doing damage. So his ship takes the lead. His 11-inch gun will fire, sails right over the Atlanta. Next shot is going to be from a 15-inch solid shot, right? And they fire that, and it will hit mid part of the casemate right above where a 6.4-inch gun is. It will break the iron plate. It will break the backing, sending splinters everywhere, losing an entire gun crew, damaging another gun crew. And so Rodgers thinks he's doing pretty good. He then will send another shot, a 15-inch shot, that is going to bounce off the shutter. They're trying to, you can see the shutter right up there, right? I think I'm going to show it to you. Maybe not. Well, anyway, you can see it between the two men. And so it hits it as they're opening it. Of course, it sends shrapnel inside. More people are killed and wounded. Another shot comes from the 11-inch gun that hits the vessel right here at its knuckle. So the knuckle is where you see the anchor? So the knuckle begins right as you make that curve. That only has 2-inch iron plate. So the shot hits it, however, it only causes a leak. But Rodgers is not done. And so Rodgers fires another 15-inch shell, or solid shot, which will take off the top of the pilot house. Okay. Now remember, the Atlanta can't really fire back. They do fire 7 shots, but they're ineffective. And actually, when you lose the top of your pilot house, what is it time to do? Surrender, right? And so the Atlanta surrenders. The Weehawken in the hunt pulls it off the sandbar. They take it under its own power up to Port Royal Sound, and then it is going to be repaired and placed into service in the U.S. Navy, and it serves in the James River. Our best photographs of the ship is going to be while it's a Union ship. Now, I don't want to go there yet. So here's a great, you know what it's like if you're in the U.S. Navy and you capture live, as they would say, a Confederate ironclad? You're the hero of the nation. You get the thanks of Congress. You get a prize money. They judge the Atlanta worth $350,000, which is over $5 million today. And so, and everyone got to split it. All the crew members, even the commanding officer, who by that time is John Dahlgren. So you want to capture a ship, and they do so. So really what's going to happen is that after all the success, he comes to Washington, banquets are made in his honor, and then he's assigned to go to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where he is going to take command of a ship under construction, another bad design by our hero John Erickson, and this is the USS Puritan. Now, when they launched the ship, Worden is there as an inspector, John Worden, and they said they couldn't get it out of the ship house, right? In other words, they couldn't get it to slide down. It took 3 times for them to finally get it into the water. It was a huge vessel and never finished during the war, and actually was finished far after the war in the 1880s. So Rodgers doesn't do anything else during the Civil War. Then basically he will be named in 1866 to command the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and in 1869 he's going to be promoted to Rear Admiral, and he takes command of the Asiatic Fleet, where on 10 June 1871, there you can see Rodgers with the beneath chin whiskers looking at us directly on the right. He plans the invasion of what? Korea. That's right. On 10 June 1871, he will land Marines and Blue Jackets, and because the Koreans had stripped a merchant ship of Americans known as the William Tecumseh Sherman, and so they don't like that. Now the Koreans have matchlock rifles, pikes and things like that, and of course the Marines have revolvers and rolling block Remington rifles, carbines, so quick to fire. So the big thing is that they defeat the Koreans. There is kind of a diplomatic fuss, but Rodgers escapes any censure because he said they deserve that after looting one of our nation's ships. Whoa. So then he's going to be assigned to the Mare Island shipyard on 13 June 1873 After serving there for 4 years, he will then be named as commander of the U.S. Naval Observatory, in which he will serve there from 1877 until his death in 1882. Just think about John Rodgers as a commander, you know. He was able to take over this major expedition and in the North Pacific, and actually he became himself a botanist during that, collecting samples and everything like that. So he commanded this expedition, and he then, during the Civil War, he has 3 points of outstanding service. Number one, trying to blow up the dry dock at Gosport Navy Yard, and you saw all the flames and everything. Just think, he's running around in all this. See the ship houses? He has to pass by those to get to the dry dock. So this is really dangerous duty. Nevertheless, Rodgers sticks to it. Of course, the dry dock does not blow up. He's captured, but he's never listed as a POW. And just like the soldiers at Fort Sumter, what do they do? We captured you. Well, here's a boat. Go back to New York, you know, and we don't want you here. So this is the early war. So I think Rodgers, as you can see, is a very forthright officer. By starting the Western Flotilla and the city-class ironclads, he begins the great maritime advantage that the Union will have in the Mississippi Valley, which very much results in the Union victory. He then will be in command of a punk ship, as he calls it, but nevertheless, he is willing to test it at risk to his own life, and he proves the ship so bad that in his report, he says, you should take the armor off of it and use it as a gunboat. And guess what? They said, you're right, and they took the armor off. Then as commander of the Weehawken, I have to tell you, just fighting at Fort Sumter, just think, I want to be the lead ship. If I'm the lead ship, that means I'm going to be the guy that actually captures Charleston if we're successful. That's if we're successful. But the torpedo raft will mean the ship is too unwieldy. It's under too much pressure from 100 heavy guns. And so he has to retreat. That's his last thing he does with the Weehawken until he captures the Atlanta. You know how many ironclads, Confederate ironclads, we capture whole? The Tennessee and the Atlanta. All right, so that makes John Rodgers immediately one of the great heroes of the Civil War. And he is just merely following in his family's footsteps. He also creates an example to his son, his nephew, all who serve the U.S. Navy in the same manner that John Rodgers does.